This week's module examines the post-war settlement which contributed to the emergence of the Cold War, as well as a move towards European unity. At the same time, the post-war period saw Europe's retreat from the world with the collapse of empires during decolonization. These processes shaped the direction of European relations, which were transformed after the destruction of the Second World War. The end of the war was signaled by the occupation of Germany and the destruction of the Nazi regime. The four major powers, the United States, the Soviet Union, Great Britain, and a renewed France, each controlled part of Germany, but disagreed on what the country should look like. Both France and the Soviet Union wanted a de-unified Germany, broken into small states, while the United States and Great Britain wanted a strong unified state, to prevent another war. The disagreement between the powers meant that diplomacy would be key to sorting out these differences. Another issue was the increased popularity of communism after the war. The sacrifice of the Soviet Union, which engaged the largest percentage of the Wehrmacht, gave the communists a patina of importance and heroism. The participation of communists in resistance movements in France, Italy, and Yugoslavia also contributed to their popularity. The United States was concerned that the destruction experienced in Europe would lead to a communist wave sweeping the continent. To counter this perceived threat, the United States provided the Marshall Plan to counteract the popularity of the Soviets. The Marshall Plan included all European states, even those that had become communist in the East. The Marshall Plan helped economies to build infrastructure which was destroyed during the war that would allow for economic rebuilding. After the war, many states sought to enact justice against the Nazis and their allies. However, these trials were not exactly balanced between the different states, and some states that actively collaborated did not persecute many after the war, for example in France. Also, there were numerous examples of popular reprisals, vigilante justice against collaborators that were often carried out by resistance fighters themselves. Another group that was targeted was women, who were accused of being quote-unquote horizontal collaborators. These women often had their heads shaved and were paraded around town squares as a form of punishment. Besides these forms of retribution, the Nuremberg trials were an international tribunal designed to punish the Nazis for a new crime, crimes against humanity. The Nazi elite was charged at Nuremberg, but this issue was quickly pushed aside due to the growing tensions between the Soviets and the other allies. The Soviet control of Eastern Europe led to these tensions, as the Red Army liberated the states in the East but helped to set up communist governments there. The Soviets also continued to resist German integration. The experience of the war in Eastern Europe ended with political revolutions that led to communist control that lasted for over 50 years. In 1948, the Western Allies unified their sectors of Germany to create the Federal Republic of Germany. The former capital of Germany, Berlin, had been jointly occupied, but it remained deep in Soviet territory. The Soviets, in protest against the other Allies, blocked ground access to Berlin, but the Allies airlifted supplies to their parts of the city for the next 8 months. Stalin eventually relented on his blockade, but this disagreement led to the break between the East and the West, with what Churchill called the Iron Curtain. Even so, Eastern Europeans challenged Soviet rule. With the death of Stalin in 1953, a new leader appeared, Nikita Khrushchev, who had more liberal ideas than Stalin. Khrushchev called for a thaw in the Cold War and encouraged dissent in the Soviet state, as well as for Eastern European states to develop their own forms of communism. However, in the instances when Eastern Europeans went into revolt, for example, East Germany in 1953 and Hungary and Poland in 1956, the Soviets sent the military there to reinforce communist rule. Despite the divide of the Cold War, Europe was also moving towards integration and unity in 3 important ways: diplomatically, militarily, and economically. The nations that had fought 2 destructive wars in the 20th century were increasingly becoming allies. In terms of diplomacy, Europeans used the Forum of the United Nations as a method of conflict resolution. Established in 1945, the United Nations began with 51 nations, including 5 permanent members: the United States, Great Britain, France, the Soviet Union, and China. The United Nations served as a Cold War arena and kept tensions between states in Europe at a minimum. Militarily, 2 organizations, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, and the Warsaw Pact illustrate how European states were willing to cooperate in military alliances. These allies included states that were just at war with each other, such as France and West Germany. Both of these organizations revealed a turn to more European notions of security outside of the tradition of nationalism. Most important was the economic integration, pioneered with the European Coal and Steel Community. The community consisted of 6 states, shown here in blue, that operated as a single state and ignored national boundaries concerning the production of steel and coal. This integration allowed these states to compete with the larger powers of the United States and the Soviet Union. This economic integration also led to economic success in West Germany, known as the Wirtschaftswunder, and in France, known as les Trente Glorieuses, in which their economies grew again and became important parts of the world economy. The Treaty of Rome in 1957 laid down the idea of a common market, the end of all tariffs in Europe, an important precursor to today's European Union. As Europe was integrating, both France and Great Britain were ending their empires. Decolonization took place in earnest beginning in the 1950s and saw the independence of nearly 70 nations after 1956. However, these new states had often continued ties with their former imperial powers. Decolonization was also characterized by civil wars and government upheaval, and occurred within the context of the Cold War, in which the superpowers were asserting their ideas upon these new states. British decolonization began in India, where the British government was pressured by India's nationalist movements after World War I. 2 leaders, Gandhi and Nehru, proposed Indian independence from Great Britain, and Gandhi was jailed numerous times for civil disobedience. During World War II, India was offered nominal independence, but the difficulties the British faced in the empire led the Indians to demand outright independence after the war. India gained independence in 1947, and Britain divided the colony into 2 states, the Hindu India and the Muslim Pakistan. However, the 2 states could not agree on this solution, and violence between the 2 states developed. During this period, Gandhi was assassinated by an Indian extremist who believed that India was solely a Hindu state. Egypt was another British colony that had been granted independence earlier in 1922. However, the British still controlled the Suez Canal. The president of Egypt, General Nasser, demanded that the British turn over control of the canal to the Egyptians in the early 1950s. Eventually, Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956 as a method of paying for the Aswan Dam and the electrification of Egypt. This forced the British to leave. In conjunction with the French, the British manufactured a crisis which would allow them to reoccupy the canal. With the assistance of an Israeli invasion, the British occupied the canal in 1956. However, both the United States and the Soviet Union pressured the British to withdraw, illustrating the end of British power to dictate empire. The character of British decolonization was relatively peaceful during the process, but often violent afterwards. Also, the new states had continued economic ties with Britain, creating further complications. Within Britain, however, there was little domestic debate about abandoning the empire. In contrast, French decolonization was quite different. For example, in Indochine, Vietnam, the French were chased out during World War II. Ho Chi Minh, the leader of the communists who fought against the Japanese, was elected president in 1945. The French returned in 1946, demanding control over the colony and a continuation of empire. However, Ho Chi Minh and his soldiers, the Viet Minh, waged a war against the French army that continued until 1954, when the French were soundly defeated and withdrew from Vietnam. The other major action during decolonization was in Algeria, which was different from other colonies. Algeria was actually part of France and had numerous white settlers, numbering over 1.2 million. However, Algerian nationalists pushed for independence beginning in 1954. In order to placate Arab nationalists, the French granted independence to the 2 colonies surrounding Algeria. However, the white settlers were concerned that the French government was going to eventually abandon Algeria, and in 1956 rioted against the French government, forcing the French government to send a greater military presence. The presence of the French military in Algeria made matters worse, especially since the military was sympathetic to the Algerian settlers. An insurrection in 1958, led by parts of the military, caused the collapse of the French government, and the return of Charles de Gaulle to the political scene. De Gaulle was initially set on keeping Algeria in France, but soon changed his mind. This change led to terrorist attacks from both sides, either those seeking to make Algeria independent or those seeking to keep it French. Eventually, Algerian independence was recognized in 1962, after years of violence. So, French decolonization can be characterized by violent warfare and by social divisions within France over whether or not to keep the empire.